to Behind the Scenes. I'm your host, Hector Montalvo. This show is dedicated to asking tough questions for you, the viewers. We bring you their responses, and we let you decide. Last week, we talked a little bit about harassment versus restraining orders. We discovered that due process and equal protection can be violated. Joining us in the studios today, we have Donald Schwartz, and we have Joe Urinek. I'd like to welcome you guys to the show.
Thank you, Hector.
Thank you for having us.
My first question is, what are some of the ways that your rights can be violated within the system?
Go ahead, Don. You can take the first shot at that.
All right, yeah. I'll take the lead in. Basically, many people who wind up in court find themselves at a disadvantage because they have no concept of what's going on in court. Now, judges are supposed to be there to take and protect your rights, as to if you have an attorney. But attorneys fear judges. I've had many attorneys tell me that they would never get a judge angry at them. So immediately right there you start losing your rights because the attorneys are afraid to speak out for you, and the judge is not going to do anything that they don't feel is a blatant violation of your rights.
But doesn't attorneys take a sworn oath to protect everybody's rights?
Oh, you're absolutely correct. I think that's Chapter 221, Section 38, if I recall off the top of my head. But it's an empty oath of office. A judge swears the same oath, too. Now, if a judge sees an attorney acting improperly or unprofessionally, under Rule 309 of the SJC court rules, they're supposed to sanction or punish that attorney. Well, if you've had any contact with the Board of Bar Overseers, you might as well contact the kids playing on the playground, because nothing happens.
Now, the bar overseers, what is the bar overseers? For those that are watching might not understand what the bar of overseers is.
Allegedly, it is a section of the Supreme Judicial Court that reviews complaints made against attorneys, and to take appropriate action against those attorneys if they feel it is warranted. But here's the thing, if you send in a complaint, it is confidential and private. You cannot divulge the information in that complaint to anyone else, otherwise you can be held liable.
But don't we have the rights to public information, Freedom of Information Act? Can we get these type of complaints?
No, you cannot. I've been in situations with corrupt attorneys, and I'll use the term freely, corrupt. And I asked for any presentation of any complaints against the attorney, and they says that's privileged information and we cannot divulge it. Well then, how do I know to take the next step and make an even broader complaint if I don't know how many complaints have been made against the attorney? Silence. The Board of Bar Overseer. It's the same thing too with the clerks of courts and judges. Any complaints that you make against those public servants are privileged.
That's interesting.
There's no transparency, Hector.
It's not open and transparent.
No.
We did invite members from the Family Probate Court or the Judiciary Branch of Government to join us in the studios today, and they declined to show up and appear. But let me ask you, Joe, where do you see the problems with due process and open and transparency?
Well, just let me state that I think that Don had a good explanation of what's going on, and I think there's two problems with the system right now, the court system. We have the CYO problem, which is cover your behind, and we also have this inbreeding that's going on, in a sense, because the judiciary is controlled by a trade organization, which is the Bar Association. So I'll answer your question in a moment, but I just want to say the trade organization begins at the highest level, and it continues right down to the district courts, because when people become judges, for example, they go through the process of the Judicial Nominating Committee, which is a trade organization, essentially, of 21, 23 lawyers who will approve the nomination in their group to pass it on to the Governor's Council. Now, as you know, the Governor's Council is the only opportunity that the general public has to have a say in the individuals who will become judges in all the state courts. And so what we have essentially, except for that small keyhole of the Governor's Council, we have an institution of the judiciary being controlled by one group of people, that is the Bar Association in the state. Now, where does it come into, how does that affect the due process and transparency? Well, as Don mentioned, you have people who are lawyers and judges who in the end will want to consider their own self-interest. Will a lawyer vigorously defend a plaintiff or a respondent in a court if it's going to offend a judge? They won't do it. And so most people will be better off by going into court pro se. If they have lots of money, they might think, oh, I have lots of money, I can pay the best lawyer and they'll fight vigorously for me. Perhaps there are some lawyers who will go to the edge, but they'll never go as far as someone who is a competent pro se person acting on their own behalf to really say to the judge, you're wrong, you're not giving me my due process rights, and I want this to change, I don't accept it, I object, and try to do as best as they can for their own behalf. Because the pro se person is not an official of the court as all the lawyers are. You have an opening there to protect yourself and to defend your rights.
And how, pro se, when you say pro se, what is pro se?
Pro se means you essentially act on your own behalf.
So you're representing yourself.
You represent yourself. You don't have a lawyer acting on your behalf. You don't have a hired gun, so to speak, to be your mouthpiece in the court, with all its failings, as I just indicated, because that person acting on your behalf, when push comes to shove, 99.9% of them will not go that extra mile if it will offend the court or the judge that's sitting before them.
Wouldn't that be a conflict of interest, though? I mean, isn't that a conflict of interest where you have judges and lawyers basically working behind closed doors on cases that affecting people in general?
I think it does indicate a general corruption in the court, yes, and I'll use that in the broadest sense. I don't use it in the sense of someone handing money to somebody behind the closed door, but just in the sense that it's a self-interested endeavor going on there, and you can't have real justice happening when you have that institutionalized corruption that's going on there.
Donald, what rules do the rules apply to pro se litigants as well as attorneys, or who does the rule apply to?
Well, it's funny. The rules are supposed to apply to the operation of the court, so that everybody plays by the same rules. But an attorney, and I'll back this up with Joe, an attorney is a commercial operation, okay? He's there getting money. Win or lose, he gets paid. So, I mean, it's not like if your boat sinks, you get your money back. If you lose your case with the attorney, they still get paid. So, I mean, this is why corruption and unprofessionalism is supposed to be held to very high standards, but sadly, this is not the case. But an attorney who aggravates a judge, that judge, I, Don Schwartz, aggravate Judge Hector Montalvo. Judge Hector Montalvo talks to his other fellow judges and says, that guy Don Schwartz, that attorney, I can his motions all the time. It cost him so much that nobody wants to take and hire him because he can't get a motion into court. It's just that simple, Hector. But I mean, the court rules are supposed to protect myself from bad judges because an unprofessional judge. But go ahead and submit a complaint to the Commission on Judicial Conduct. Nothing will happen. Submit a bill of address. I have submitted a bill of address to have a bad judge, censored or, in some way handled with the court. And nothing happens. Do you know that if you try to find out how many bills of address have been submitted to the general court in Boston, you can't get an idea? Nobody knows. There is no transparency. And with this television show, I believe that every courtroom should have television cameras therein so that the people in Methuen can turn on the television set and see what's going on in their courthouse that their tax dollars are paying for. But guess what, Hector? You can't do that. The judges won't let you see what's going on in the courthouses.
And I'll quickly just state that this show has sent out numerous of requests to the court system, requesting for permission to record in the court system. And we found that they have not been open and transparent as well. Most of our requests have been either ignored or declined or just never heard back from. Which leads me, why isn't the court open and transparent? Isn't there constitutional where the courts remain open to the public?
If I may, I would say that there's a self-interest in keeping as much behind closed doors as possible. So I think the general thought is, who wants to air their dirty laundry in the public view? Not very many people, certainly not the courts.
But these are
and there is a fair amount of dirty laundry going on in the courts when, if people were to examine the procedures and the lack of due process that goes on there, the more the public knows, the more they would be held accountable. But I think the whole system is, it's running on oxygen, it's running on fumes now. I mean, they're keeping these, the courts running, despite the fact that people are not getting their rights protected in the courts. And if they open that up and let people see, the whole system could come crashing down. I mean, the more people realize how unjust the court system is to most people that go in there, the more outrage there'll be, and there'll be calls for serious reform in the court system. So much so that you might see, for example, divorce cases being taken out of the courts. I mean, divorce cases are a travesty in the state of Massachusetts, and perhaps nationwide, but we're familiar with Massachusetts. The only benefit that comes from divorce in Massachusetts is the amount of money that the legal system is able to suck out of it. Because there's no reason that people should lose their life savings and everything they save for in a divorce. There's no reason for it, just to have it go into the back pocket or the front pocket of the lawyers who are involved. If I just may, I would say that, getting back to what Don said about the general court and the bill of address, we all know why that doesn't go anywhere. Most of the members of the general court are lawyers.
Oh,
and so right. they're not going to act on anything that undertakes serious reform.
Adversely affects them.
Right, and but again, the more light that's shown on that problem, and the fact that the nub of the problem we're facing lies in the fact that it's controlled by the legal aristocracy and the trade group known as the Bar Association.
Correct.
Give us some examples as to how the system violates the due process. Either one of you.
May I jump in?
Yeah, sure.
I live in the town of Stoughton, and the FBI has been investigating our police department. They've been corrupt for decades, and I'll use the term properly, the corruption, extortion, money laundering, etc., drugs. We had a Stoughton police officer, a sergeant, that was indicted of a crime, and he was at the Norfolk Superior Court in Dedham. The Norfolk Superior Court in Dedham is the same courthouse where Sacco and Vanzetti were tried in. And if you took the electric lights out and the telephone, you would not know that anything had changed in that court, because during the trial, the attorney for the sergeant was drawing on a piece of paper, taking the paper to the 16 jurors and passing it around. There was no electronics in there, there was no television cameras, there was no playback, there was nothing. And on top of this, the court personnel closed the courtroom during voir dire, which is a public seating so that everybody can see who comes before the court as a juror. They were denied that right. He was denied that right. I'm sitting there, and I could see the sign on the door. It says, jury selection closed. And even the man's attorney came out and took a photograph of it. That's how our rights are being denied. Can you imagine if there had been television cameras in that court, and this is August 2007, that man's rights would have been protected. He went through trial, he was convicted, his conviction was overturned, and he's going to get retried again this November. And Hector, Joe, do you know who's going to pay for that? Everybody who's watching this show, because of corruption in the courts.
Now, the FBI is the leading agency responsible to investigate corruption. What are they doing about it, if you have any knowledge in regards to that?
I have no knowledge of that. I don't know what the FBI is doing.
We're actively, we had been under investigation by the FBI in Stoughton. They found a few corrupt cops who had lied, and they packed up their bags and left. The standard to have a police officer held accountable are so high that short of murder or robbery, nothing's going to happen. I mean, I was arrested by Stoughton police, and the Stoughton police pled the fifth in open court. And Judge Robert Schreiber said, okay, they're pleading the fifth. I says, Your Honor, how do I get to face my accusers if they're pleading the fifth and they haven't been charged with a crime? How do they get the right to plead the fifth? Silence. That's corruption, Hector. That's corruption. Happens every day in court.
Where do the people turn to get relief from their grievances?
Good question.
That's why I'm here today, talking to you.
Well, I think
hopefully
you have to
somebody.
get the word out as much as possible. I think right now in the country generally there's a general awakening of ordinary people that the government is distant and far away from the main concerns of the public. Their laws are passed and actions are taken by the government that perhaps the vast majority of people are opposed to. If you think of the restraining order laws, which I know that you're familiar with and Don's familiar with, I mean that began in the late 1970s, right here in Massachusetts, and now it's nationwide. At that particular point in time, I think the populace was somewhat sleeping, and they said, "Well, this sounds like a good law. Let's go along with it. It seems it's meant to protect women from violent husbands." Well, it is nothing of the sort. It basically is a tool to club men into submission and to deprive them of their rights. Of due process in the courts and of their children if they have family, because all it takes is the accusation of a complaint, and a man is forced out of their home, and perhaps they lose their children for many years. Perhaps they lose a lot of financial assets they might have. Perhaps they lose their professional licenses if they're a law enforcement person. And so right now, as your question was, how do we do something about this? I think that we have to look at what's happening generally in the culture. And right now in the United States, I think more and more people are becoming aware that they can't just accept what's presented to them as the given fact by the government or by the people who make our policies as accurate and true. They question things. And it's an opportunity, I think, for people like ourselves to go out and speak to people and say, this is a real problem. It's causing a real problem across the country. It's causing a real problem here in the state. And we need to have drastic reform, a drastic change, which a lot of people who are in the institutions will not like, but we have to make those changes anyways.
And if there was a budget cut in regards to holding people accountable, who would be affected the most? Would the people benefit from cutting budgets from those that are not open and transparent or who are operating behind closed doors?
Well, I think budget cuts are always a difficult question, because as soon as you cut budgets, you end up cutting people off of payrolls, and that's always going to be hard for those people who are on those payrolls. Unfortunately, budget cuts usually affects the low-hanging fruit in any institution. The people who are in positions of authority and power in the court system, for example, will be the last to be affected. And so any budget cuts should be targeted at those who are in positions of authority and policy making before they target the people who are the office workers, for example, in the court. The clerk's office, for example, we should be targeting the administrative offices and the middle management of the courts, so that innocent people who are really there making a living for themselves and doing what they're told to do, by and large, are not inordinately affected.
It's interesting because on our last show we had the two attorneys, and one of the attorneys brought up that the ex parte orders that are issued out of the court may be a violation of constitutional rights. And you mentioned a little while ago that you see it a lot with families and so on. So there is some type of abuse going on with these particular orders that are affecting taxpayers, affecting children, affecting families as well.
Sure. Whether or not the ex parte orders are a violation, I would tend to believe they are, just strictly on their face. But in particular, if you look at an ex parte order that throws a man out of his home and away from, and separates him from his children, it's a human rights violation as far as I'm concerned, because all it takes to have that happen is the statement of one person. Now, this kind of psychological, basing law on psychological states of mind is a horrible, horrible thing that we've gotten ourselves into. And so we have to really attack the problem in two fronts. One is legislatively, and the other is to look at the people who are judges and becoming judges, and trying to prevent the worst people from becoming judges in the state, because someone who actually has no understanding of the problem, or perhaps even sympathizes with this type of law, is a real danger to the general populace, and we have to prevent them from becoming judges.
If I may add to that, remember Judge Lopez? She got in the face of a district attorney over sentencing. and her actions were absolutely unprofessional. I've seen that happen in court with other judges,
Right.
but sadly those judges were not on TV. Hector, if we could take and get television cameras into the courtrooms of Massachusetts, you would see such an improvement in law, because the normal average... I tell people law is not rocket science. I am a degreed engineer. I've met rocket scientists, and I've met judges, and judges ain't rocket scientists, and most attorneys aren't either. It's a liberal arts degree. You're working with words in that. Very, very simple. But if you get the average citizen to be able to observe what's going on in a courtroom and to see how failed some of the attorneys are and how inept some of the judges are, the courts could open from 9 to 11 and close for the rest of the day. But they're open day long, and all those pensioned workers have to be paid, Hector. So how do you do that? And do we see the police officers coming in day after day after day? Well, I arrested this person, charges dismissed. I arrested this person, charges dismissed. Wait a second. What's your percentile of arrest and convictions, sir? Mr. Officer, you seem to be getting a lot of arrests that are never prosecuted, but yet you're getting paid 4 hours overtime to show up in court for that arrest, win or lose. That costs money, Hector. We have to get the television cameras, and it's cheap money. It's short money. The cameras don't have to run 24/7. Just a few hours in the morning, maybe an hour or so in the afternoon. That's it.
I think even if they did run 24/7 or all during the court hours, it would still be relatively inexpensive. Technology is very cheap. On that score, I don't know if you're familiar with it, maybe you can fill us in, but there was some information recently that said one of the courts, I'm not sure which one, actually is paying WBUR in Boston, someone, to actually put a camera in the court. But it was an extraordinary amount of money they were going to pay to have
We've
this
got
done.
cameras up on Blue Hills looking at the clouds and the birds flying by, but
Right.
we can't see what's going on.
Well, they were giving WBUR almost $500,000.
The SJC at times will take and record its proceedings on that, which is another question. Hector, why can't I go in and record my court proceedings? Why do I have to spend $5,000 for the court transcripts? Wouldn't it just be easier if I just take and video record it?
Well,
if everybody video records it and I spend $1 for the CD or the DVD and walk out the door?
I think the SJC...
Why do we need a stenographer from the 1700s sitting in a courtroom?
And if it's open to the public, then everything should be public, correct? I mean, they audio tape it, but they don't videotape it.
No.
What about those tapes? Who has control over those audio tapes? I mean, can they do anything with those audio tapes?
The courthouse does, and you have to purchase them if you want them. And after 5 years, they throw them away. Why don't they contact the parties in the case and say, hey, we're getting rid of these. You want to buy these? Short money. How much does an audio cassette cost?
Well, we looked into that, and that's a good question.
Yeah.
My understanding in asking the court in regards to a copy of a CD, they charged me $50.50 for a CD on audio, and it was only a 2-minute hearing.
I still think they charge 50 cents for a copy, don't they?
Well, they told me $50.
A paper copy.
I bring my own camera in, and I bring my own photographic equipment. They can't stop you. It's free.
They can't.
But I think that the SJC does video record the hearings there. I know that a person that we're familiar with, Lawrence Watson and Mike Carusi, who are both very active in promoting fathers' rights, they've been before the state's Supreme Judicial Court, and their hearings have been recorded on their site, and you can go on the web and get those. But as Don says, this is just one piece of it. I mean, all the district courts should have this technology there, and it can be done very cheaply. But I think you get down to the point where they're not going to rush into it, because there's so much dirty linen going on in the courts that they're afraid of what people are going to do, I think, once this is opened up to the general public.
No,
although they'll use the excuse that they need to have this objective setting there to keep the public out of it, public influence. But I think that's a real smokescreen, because there's nothing objective happening in the courts. It's a trade industry group controlling the affairs of everyone that goes through the court doors.
So if you can't hold judges and you can't hold lawyers and accountable, or the legislature accountable, what do the people need to do? I mean, what is it going to take to get open and transparency, to get the Declaration of the Right?
Well, how did it happen a couple hundred years ago? there's that R word that comes up. There was a revolution in the history, and it always happens eventually. The United States is not immune from these kinds of activities. I don't think we're anywhere near there at this point, but we're certainly heading in a direction where more and more people are becoming dissatisfied with the government. We can see it all over the country now. The Tea Party, I think, is a good example of the dissatisfaction of the general populace, people who are not generally active politically and they want change in the government.
Well, let me just say real quick, if you have a concern or a question that you want government to answer, you can always email the show at the Hector Montalvo Show at yahoo.com. You can also visit our website at behindthescenes.weebly.com. Joe, we have 2 minutes left real quickly. If anybody wanted to reach you, and I understand you're the chairman of the Fatherhood Coalition. What is the Fatherhood Coalition? If you can just explain that real quickly.
Okay, the Fatherhood Coalition is a nonprofit group, an advocacy group that's been around since 1994. And the goal of the group is to promote the interests of men and fathers in the state, recognizing the number of laws and the behavior of the courts towards men and fathers are basically unjust. We want to promote the rights of men and fathers in the courts and through the legislature activity.
And Donald, how can people get a hold of you if they needed to reach you?
At this point in time, I don't have an operation ongoing, but if people do have questions, if I've lit up something in some folks out there, I would ask them to contact you, and you could forward it to me, because I'm kind of strung out trying to help people all over the place right now with certain circumstances that they find themselves in. So I will pass that along to you, Hector.
Well, I appreciate it. I want to thank you, the viewers. Thanks my guests for coming in today. Thank you, the viewers, for watching. This is Behind the Scenes. I'm Hector Montalvo. We'll bring you next week's episode. Thanks for watching.